Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast, a podcast about stage musicals that have been legally filmed and publicly distributed. The Filmed Live Musicals website contains information on nearly 200 musicals that have been captured live. Check it out at filmedlivemusicals.com. And now, on with the show. Welcome to the Filmed Live Musicals podcast. I'm your host, Luisa Lyons, and my guest today is Doug Reside, curator of the Billy Rose Theatre Division at the New York Public Library, and author of a fascinating new book, Fixing the Musical: How Technology Shaped the Broadway Repertory, which looks at how the musicals that we remember and the ones that are the most performed are the musicals that were able to use the technologies of their time, such as cast recording, sheet music, and of course video, to document and share the work with those who would never see the original productions on stage. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
It is my pleasure. So, having read the book, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the first question that I ask all my guests. But what made you fall in love with musical theater?
Oh, well, yeah. So as I talk about in the book, I grew up in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri, in Florissant. And St. Louis is a fairly theater-rich town. There's the St. Louis Muni, which is a big 10,000 seat amphitheater that has about 8 productions, 6 to sometimes even more than 8 productions every summer. And the last 2 rows, which amount to about 2,000 seats, are free for a kind of on a first come first served basis. These are the productions that happen at the Muni are Broadway. They're directed by Broadway directors. There's often Broadway talent and mixed in with local talent as well. So it is a very kind of high quality local theater that was very accessible to me, even not really coming from a particularly theater background. Where my family wasn't a particularly theater going family. Also in this Florissant library, there were the cast recordings on LPs, and so I would, as I got into musicals, I would check them out and try to understand what these shows were, because I really loved the shows that I saw at the Muni and at the Fox Theater, which was the touring venue in St. Louis.
And you mentioned in the book also watching shows on like PBS, great performances and things like that.
That's right. Yeah. So we didn't have cable when I was growing up, but St. Louis had about 6 to 7 network or broadcast stations, and PBS was one of the stations that we got the clearest on our family television. So it was one of those we watched a lot, and so I did try to set the timer on the VCR anyway to tape shows like the Into the Woods broadcast. And I remember Sweeney Todd actually wasn't broadcast while I was a kid, so I had to get that when I went to college. There was a VHS copy in the college library. But yeah, so watching those on PBS was really informative as well.
And you ended up studying a kind of a variety of things. I read that you studied English, computer science and a minor in theater. What led you to studying English rather than theater?
Yeah, so I went to school in rural Missouri in Truman State University, which is a small liberal arts college, just kind of about 30 miles south of the Iowa border on the north end of the state. And theater was not really something that I saw people doing in my doing professionally. It was something that a lot of people did and enjoyed, but it didn't seem like there was a way to make a life in theater that I had experience with growing up in where I did. And so I also loved literature. I mean, it wasn't that English was a second choice so much. It was just that I saw that there were clearer ways forward with an English degree, and also I could still look at I could study theater whenever I was in a lot of my English classes. So yeah, I guess that's how that happened.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by the computer science part, kind of alongside that.
Yeah, I was fortunate in that early on when I was a kid, my dad bought a Commodore 64. I think at a grocery store, actually. It was at a period of time when home computers were just becoming something that I don't think that the market they quite figured out, especially in Missouri, where computers fit, whether they were kind of a home appliance or whether they were something more like a television or a stereo. So anyway, all that is to say, I got a computer and taught myself to program in BASIC on the Commodore, and found that the work of programming computer games at the time and the work of writing my own stories or plays sort of activated the same part of my brain that were things that I enjoyed doing. So I didn't really actually, and also that was the era when there were it was called interactive fiction, where it was essentially text-based games where you were told a story and you know told your character to go north or take flower pot or whatever, and then you did things in the game. And so that connection between literature and computer and software development just felt very natural, and I didn't really want to not do one or the other. So I actually declared a major in English and then kept taking computer science classes till I ended up with a computer science major as well, or double major. So
Oh, cool. Oh, so you did them simultaneously.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's super awesome. And I'm curious, has that that love for both, that must be really fascinating now with all the like virtual theater and the way theater is starting to embrace technology in that way.
Yeah, no, especially, I mean, you know, as difficult as the COVID period was, it was really interesting to see some of the things that I and my colleagues. So I guess I should say I finished the two undergrad degrees, and then did a PhD in English. But and so during that period, I was writing a lot about technical, like digital humanities, and ways in which computer technology intersects with literature and theater. And so during the pandemic, it was really interesting to see how some of those ideas that a lot of us had talked about began to play out in real-time experiments in society, because it was the only thing that we could do. So yeah, I mean, obviously it was a really terribly difficult time, but also a really fascinating time for people interested in technology and theater.
Yeah. And you mentioned doing your thesis combining theater and English, and really interesting paper on electronic editions of musical theater texts. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so my dissertation was on, so I tried to propose a textual critical theory for musical theater that, so when literary scholars look at Shakespeare or Greek texts, the Greek plays, there are lots of different copies of these plays, often in manuscript form, so things that people had written out by hand. And usually those copies are not in the hand of the author. So actually, Shakespeare, we don't have any manuscript copies. We have lots of early printed copies. So, and at the time that Shakespeare was writing, printing was almost more like manuscript, and that was very kind of like a homebrewed activity. So anyway, so like the early copies of Hamlet, for instance, are very, very different than the folio version, which is the one that most of us know. I think to be or not to be is something like to be or not to be, I, there's the point, and so it goes, or something like that, and then he leaves and then the folios. So I was interested in taking the theory that had been developed over the last 100 years or so for studying how to deal with texts where there's multiple different versions and no one is clearly the right one, and applying that to very recent musical theater texts, which have a whole different set of questions with where authorship is collaborative, and also, as a lot of people have noted, always in development, that the whole musicals aren't so much written as rewritten, that they're constantly being further developed and developed with different collaborators, often with different directors and writers. So I wanted to look at that textual theory, and my thesis was that the best way of producing or of looking at musical theater editions was through electronic editions. And so I did an electronic edition of the musical Parade, Jason Robert Brown and Alfred Urry's musical Parade, just for the dissertation. I wasn't able to publish it, but I was able to put it into the dissertation. And so the majority of the text of the dissertation is kind of laying out the theory for this this web-based dissertation that actually ran on a CD-ROM. And then the CD-ROM is still at the University of Kentucky, but it maybe still works. I don't know. I've tried getting it to work before since then, and most of it actually it has QuickTime doesn't work anymore, so the audio files don't play, but everything else seems like it still mostly works.
It's crazy to me how quickly technology is becoming obsolete. Like, forget the span of like a century, like it's happening within a decade, and within a couple of decades, that the technology that we used not so long ago it's like, how do we play a CD anymore?
No, that's a really important point for my current profession. So I think, as maybe we said, I'm the curator of the theater division at New York Public Library for the performing arts at Lincoln Center. And so a lot of what I'm faced with on a daily basis is trying to make sure that we can preserve the work that is created today on various digital platforms. As you know, we all obviously for the last 20, 30, 40 years have been working in computers in one way or the other. And while it is we figured out over the last 2,000 years how to preserve paper and ink on paper pretty effectively in library and archival sciences, the profession is still trying to figure out how we can make sure that digital files will be accessible, and the information in digital files will be accessible even in 50 years, much less 1,000 or 2,000.
Yeah, and like the scope of, first of all, digitizing everything to make sure that it's preserved digitally, but then the kind of flip side of that, how do we keep it analog so that, like you say, someone in 50 to 100 to 1,000 years can still access it? And it's so difficult when it comes to theater because we're dealing with something that's ephemeral to begin with.
Right. Yeah. No, I have toyed around with the idea of writing something about the ways in which theater and digital technology are so similar, that they are both kind of performed because it requires an audience, a user, to make the thing work, and that there is a kind of way in which it all feels very ephemeral. It isn't fixed in quite the same way in paper or stone or whatever. It's something that's called up for a minute in the ephemerality of lit pixels and screens and then goes away. And how do we preserve that experience, especially when it's collaboratively experienced, as is the case with multi-user computer games. And so a lot of people have thought about like the communities that are created, even in things as simple as something like Twitter, but more maybe in more complicated ways in things like multi-user computer games, where there might be a world that is run by a company for a period of time that's still a commercial enterprise. And then the environment in which people met each other and formed friendships and communities goes away. And so how is that history remembered by the people that participated in that is, I think, very similar to the questions that we ask when we try to preserve theater history.
Oh, that is fascinating. I never even thought about trying to preserve that history of like the RPG world. And that's really fascinating because it's like, I guess, people are recording it on YouTube and things like that, or Twitch, Discord. I don't know, but I'm not in that world, like kind of on the periphery, but that's really fascinating, because it's happened. Yeah, it's very akin to theater. Oh yes,
Right.
please write that paper.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, let's jump ahead to the book. What led you to deciding to write this book?
Yeah, so I had, like a lot of academics, I had thought of turning my dissertation into a book, but the dissertation really depended so much on that electronic edition that also depended on the cast recording at the time, because I wanted, part of the point of the dissertation was showing how the different ways in which different parts of the text are working simultaneously to help tell the full story was really important to the thesis. So anyway, for rights reasons and technical reasons, it wasn't really ever possible for me to publish my dissertation in the way that a lot of early academics do. And so I was wondering if it would be possible for me to take some of the ideas and turn them into a book over the last 15, 20 years now. And then I had been toying with the idea of a new version of the dissertation that really became the book proposal. And I presented that at a conference in Indiana a couple of years ago. I would say maybe 5 years ago in Carmel, Indiana. And at that conference, Norm, the editor of Oxford's musical theater series, Norm Hershey, he was present at that conference. And so he and I talked a little bit, and he expressed interest in seeing a book proposal based on the ideas in the paper. And so I read up the proposal, and then this seemed like I finally had a way of kind of moving forward with the ideas of the dissertation, but in a very, very different set of arguments and a much updated set of arguments. So yeah, it kind of represents, I guess, the ways in which the thoughts that began maybe with the dissertation have continued to at least develop in my own head over the last couple of decades, and then finally were realized in the book.
And I think it's really interesting that it started with, for you, it started with Parade, and how that became it developed a cult following because of that cast recording.
Mm.
And like Jason Robert Brown's work, that has often been the case with his work, like The Last 5 Years and Songs for a New World, that the cast recordings are what made those shows, and then the early bootlegs too, help make those shows accessible and popular to like college students and people who hadn't seen the original productions.
That's right. I actually encountered Jason Robert Brown first before the dissertation as an undergrad in the early days of file sharing on campus networks. So this is even just slightly prior to Napster. On a lot of college dorms, the you would have shared folders when you plugged your computer into the network, and so you could share a folder with other people on your campus network, just as if it was on your desktop. And so college kids would put their music libraries in public folders to kind of share and point people to music. And somebody had the Audra McDonald album Way Back to Paradise. And so I listened to it and liked a lot of it, but was just completely blown away by Stars on the Moon. And so I hunted down from Songs for a New World. So I hunted down the cast recording, which was back in the late 90s, a lot more difficult than it would be now. I think there's a Borders Books somewhere in St. Louis that had a copy. So, and then wanted to see what else there was, got Parade, which I think had just come out, that had closed that around that time. And then, yeah, really got interested in the rest of Jason's work.
Yeah. And then, so can you dive a bit more into like the premise of the book and what like the kind of central argument around how technology has helped us understand or helped shape what we understand to be like I love that you described the difference between canon and repertory. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, so I think a lot of this goes to my English academic background, that I think in a lot of theater departments, there's the focus on theater as something that really only exists on the stage. And of course, that is true, that it's meant to be received and studied and enjoyed in performance. But we don't we don't know, we don't tend to know shows from performances. We tend to know them from the fixed records that they leave behind. So there's a part of the United States copyright law says that it only applies to works that are fixed in a tangible medium of expression. That is to say, they have to be, just having a thought doesn't make something copyrighted, or even just saying the words, unless the words are recorded as you say them, don't make, it is not copyrightable. It has to actually be written down in something that can be reread and replayed. And so I was interested in, so the book looks at the different media technologies that have fixed theater, and particularly musical theater, into various formats that allow people outside of the theater where the show was originally performed to listen to or read or watch these texts. And what I argue is that what is preserved on those texts become what we think of as the essential elements to those shows. And the bits that aren't recorded are often the things that are kind of seen as more flexible or unfixed and maybe more open to change in a future revival or in a amateur production, that kind of thing. And then I also argue that the musicals that were particularly suited for the technologies that were for fixing, that were available at the time when they came out, are the ones that tended to enter the musical theater repertory. And I separate repertory from canon, just because I feel like there has been a lot of conversation in musical theater scholarly circles of late about re-examining the canon, recreating the canon. How was the canon formed to begin with? What is the canon? And those are all really important questions to ask. But I think one thing that we often, I think, talk about when we're talking about the canon are the shows that if I'm giving an example, I don't have to explain the plot of the show if I'm talking to people that know musical theater. That these are the shows that we know, and the reason that we know them is because they've been seen a lot, and so they're part of the repertory. That is the shows that get performed over and over again in a particular community, and the community that I look at is really North American regional theaters. So things like the Muni, but also the Barn Theater in Michigan, or Goodspeed Opera House, places that regularly perform musicals, and usually perform musicals that are not, or they may perform new musicals, but they also perform musicals that have been performed in the past, and so they do their own productions. And so I looked at, I think it was around 12, maybe I forget exactly how many, but some number of the regional theaters and all of the shows that have been done as long as they've been keeping records at those theaters. And they had to have produced at least 2 musicals a year. And so from that, I was able to get a list of several hundred shows, but it was interesting to see what that list was and to see that it does really feel like those are the shows that if I'm giving a paper at a conference or if I'm even in my book, I don't really necessarily have to talk about the whole plot and song list for Fiddler on the Roof or Sound of Music, but I might need to do that a little bit for Cradle of Rock, and I certainly would have to do it for something like The Grass Harp or Walking Happy or something like that.
Mm-hmm. And I think what's really interesting about what you're saying is that it translates also to like high school and community groups. That when you look at like the top 10 lists of what are the most performed musicals and plays, but talk about musicals, they're all things that either have had film versions or more recently filmed live versions. And they are often they're also based on movies, but it's what people know. It's what people have had access to, and that's what people are producing because it's what they know.
Absolutely, yeah. Particularly for yeah, exactly what you just said for high schools and for academic theater, or pre-college theater. The goal often is to do shows that the students know the title of and will be excited about doing that show and will want to audition for it because they know what the show is. And so in the last 20 years, maybe, there's been a real shift in the repertory, the high school repertory, from the kind of golden age Trudges and Hammerstein, Lerner, and Lowe, to a lesser extent, Frank Lesser shows, and to the often shows that weren't particularly successful in New York in their original run, but which are based on movies that the students would know, the Addams Family, that kind of thing.
Yeah, Legally Blonde.
Yeah, exactly.
So great. So I'm really interested in the way that you tracked my focus is on filmed theater. So like the history of film theater from like early television, then cable TV came in and the way that the Broadway theaters, like the Nederlanders, were behind creating like the Broadway television network, and then VHS and now digital and online. What did you what did you discover that you didn't know before as you wrote this book about the filming of live theater?
It's a good question. So I didn't actually, prior to writing the book, I didn't know a lot about that period from the shift from the late 70s to the early 80s, where there was a real interest, much as I think there is today in internet streaming theater, to find ways to make theater, to find ways to make New York theater more accessible to audiences across the country, largely to reach untapped markets for commercial reasons. So in the late 70s, for a lot of different reasons, cable television became a lot more pervasive and accessible than it had been previously. There had been things like cable television for some time, but it was really cable as we, well, I almost say that it was know it today, but maybe as we knew it 10 years ago, prior to the big streaming market. Yeah, it really emerged at that time. And so the Nederlanders and the Schuberts to some extent, and I mean, a lot of the different theater owning organizations, were interested in trying to capitalize on this new market and also get into that new part of the entertainment industry, and were bringing their own intellectual property there. The problem is, as is also the case today, that the theater unions and guilds weren't quite it was hard to know exactly what the market was, and nobody wanted to have their intellectual property sort of exploited in a way where they didn't get a share of the pie. But sometimes but because they were there sort of at the point of the filming, the market wasn't yet proven. And so in many cases, the filming was forced out of the markets where you would think it would happen. So Pippin, of course, was restaged really in Canada. It was meant to be staged in New York, but then there was a fight with the unions. They had to move it up to Canada to film it there. And then, of course, Pacific Overtures was only released in Japan. And it was filmed in New York, but only released in Japan. So, and I think we still see that tension today as we're trying to sort out what is the fair division of, I guess, the proceeds and also the risk. So so how do you divide up risk and reward when you film a new Broadway show and make it available to the public, ensuring that everybody does get a share of the pie, but also making it not so prohibitive to take that risk that producers with the money to do it aren't willing to make it happen. And just like in the early the 70s and 80s, late 70s and early 80s, there was this thought, I think Sweeney Todd, the cost of producing that was very high. And Hamilton, similarly, they famously, it's been said that it sold to Disney for in the $70 million range. And that worked, I think, for Hamilton. And other shows may say, well, we know we're not Hamilton, but then what are we? So like if it's maybe we understand we may not reach the Hamilton level, but what is the right payment schedule for a show that isn't Hamilton, or for a Come From Away or a Diana or something like that. And then I think always there's always the anxiety that there's a cannibalization of markets that I don't think is usually. It seems like it's usually the opposite happens, that people will see the show on a recorded medium and want to go see it in live, just as people do for music concerts all the time. There's this understanding that the live experience is different than the recorded experience.
Yeah, and I think, and you touched on this in the book too, that the shows that are able to embrace the technology rather than like be afraid of it are the shows that do well. So, and the most recent example that is popping in my head is Treason in the UK, where they've streamed it over the pandemic. They've released music online. There's so much content that you can access freely or for a small fee, and as a result, they've built this huge following, which is going to allow them to go to the West End and have a bigger life than just like a small run at an off West End theater. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, it really access to the content digitally really builds the market. And I think to the point of Legally Blonde, like I don't think it's the Reese Witherspoon movie that's making people that's making that the most performed show in high school, or one of the most performed shows in high schools. It's that people saw the MTV broadcast, or these days saw YouTube pirated versions of the MTV broadcast and watch it from there.
Yeah, and I feel I'm so sad about Legally Blonde because my understanding is that the contract negotiation was like 6 airings on MTV, period. And so they to do a re-release, to re-air it, to put it on DVD or make it available on a streaming platform legally requires renegotiating all of those contracts. And that's a huge, when you think of the hundreds of people involved, it's a huge undertaking. It's not impossible, but it is a big undertaking. And who has the money to do that?
Right. And then the question, and what is will the end payout from that be worth all of that? Anyway, that is the thing that makes all these film musicals in particular, the use of new technologies, whatever they are, complicated. I mean, it was true back in Oklahoma as well, that there was the fear that actually a lot of the arguments that were made by the musicians in the 1940s, late 30s and early 40s, and that led to a musician strike that really almost prevented a lot of cast recordings from coming out in the early 40s. There was this fear that the broadcast of music on the radio, and really also I think recorded music, would put musicians out of work in the same way that I think people are anxious about the way in which artificial intelligence will do the same to writers and other artists today. And it was in fact the case that a lot of musicians, when you go to a restaurant, it's only the very kind of most niche and often expensive restaurants that would have live music playing and while you eat today, but they might have a recorded thing playing above, over the speakers. My guess is that there were many more restaurants that would have had live musicians playing in the 1920s or teens, because that was the only way that you could hear music for most people anyway at that point.
Oh, that's interesting. That's an interesting comparison to make. You wrote in the book, it seems possible that in the coming years, the video may become as ubiquitous and influential as the audio cast recordings that defined the musical theater repertory of the 20th century. And like you mentioned, we need to protect artists and make sure that everybody's being compensated fairly and that who has access to these recordings. But what do you think needs to change to make it to make the recordings as ubiquitous as to make filmed recordings as ubiquitous as sound recordings?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think we need to figure out. So I guess I think that streaming and the digital environment, the current internet world that we've had for the last 30 years. But people, it's always a long tail of adoption. So people, while it's been possible, certainly, I think I had my first email address in the actually early 90s, before the web was a thing. But there are also people that I run into at the library they usually have an email address, but they may not have a computer, and have never had one. So I think there is still this slow. I mean, we think of the internet and computers as having been around for a long time now, and that certainly is the case. But still, I mean, on one sense, it's the case. It's not like this is a new fad, but it's also true that there are a lot of people who have lived most of their lives without a computer, or before the personal computer was invented, and that those folks are still around, and in some cases the ones responsible for signing contracts and making deals. And so I think we're still kind of in that digital transition, although it seems kind of weird to say that. So I think we need to get comfortable with just the way that the rest of all of society needs to kind of, as I think COVID really sort of forced a lot of people to make this transition that were long holdouts, but the internet is a platform that can be used for distributing things. And the reason that that's important is that if you've only got 6 network channels, then there's very little space to program anything that isn't going to immediately be popular with a large portion of the American public. And if you've got, let's say, 80 cable channels, that still is a relatively narrow set of people or a set of platforms on which you can program things if you only have 24 hours in a day and 7 days a week. But with the internet, there's an almost unlimited platform for trying things out, and audiences can be very segmented. So we have a way of distributing things much more broadly than we did before. And then but what we haven't quite worked out is what is the market for that? Like how do we figure out the right, like what should someone be paid for a thing that's going to stream, and do those payment schedules need to be worked out and completely fixed at the beginning of the period, or can there be ways in which it's renegotiated if the thing suddenly becomes wildly popular? And will those that are taking the largest risk at the beginning be willing to share the rewards at the end, because they understand that maybe 9 out of every 10 shows they film and stream actually lose the money? Do they need to pay for those other 9 shows with the one show that actually did make the money, even if that means that the people involved in that recording don't get as much as maybe they would have if they knew it was going to be a huge hit? So anyway, these are all complicated economic questions that I think are beyond certainly my understanding of economics and social science, but I think that's what we need to figure out, is like what is the right economic models for ensuring that people aren't exploited, but also that it is financially possible for people to take the risk to stream things.
And like you mentioned, like the internet, we just have so much content now. Like there's vast, it's just, you can't keep up with how much there is. Like I think, just film live musicals alone, pre-pandemic, like an exciting year, like 2017 had 3 whole film live musicals in 1 year. And now there's like 10 a week and I can't keep up.
Yeah.
And then with audiences, like how you find the people to watch this stuff, like physical theaters are having trouble retaining in-person audiences. So how do we, like, can digital be used to tap into to help those audiences find their way, and like the balance between in-person and digital? It's a very complicated like what's the word I'm looking for, algorithm to try and figure out.
Yeah, for sure. And also I think the pandemic, I don't think there's very much other than maybe Zoom theater that really was invented during the pandemic, but But a lot of those things became much more, as you were saying, became much, much more popular during the pandemic. And we learned a lot of different kind of genres. So there's the just streamed theater of like taking something from the archive and streaming it. And then there's the kind of something akin to a reading where you perform live, but in the whatever way that technology allows you to do it. And then there's the more things that are more like immersive theater, like more like a Sleep No More Than She Fell in purely physical space, where you enter a virtual space and then you're expected to, in some way, participate in the show. There were a few of those that happened during the pandemic that I thought during that period, those were the things that felt most like theater. And I think it was because those were the things that had that communal experience of, and often because like a reading, you often you don't necessarily know who else is going to be at the reading, but if you are the sort of person that goes to new theater readings, you often see the same people at a lot of the same readings. And so that experience of seeing or seeing a person you haven't seen for a while, even if it's in a virtual space, and then sitting together to watch the show and then talking about it afterwards, I think was most successful in those virtual theater things, that there was a kind of virtual hangout space where you could kind of move from area to area. And the only place that I mean, I think there are ways of doing that in some of the video chat programs, but I experienced it most frequently in the Oculus or Meta Quest, the headset virtual theater sorts of things.
Yeah, fixing the musical book too.
Yeah.
The digital space.
Right. Yeah.
So something that I found fascinating in the book was the chapter on bootlegs. And in my own research, when I kind of started diving into this area, I felt like I was like lifting up a rock, and there's like, oh, there's this entire ecosystem underneath that I had no idea existed. What did you discover and the particularly the recordings that the people that you spoke to that made these recordings, and dating back into the early 20th century with the opera recordings, I thought that stuff was really fascinating too. But what did you discover about the world of bootlegging theater?
Yeah, there was so I wrote this book over a longish period of time. So I think I got the contract maybe in early 2019, maybe late 2018, and it only came out this September of 2023. So and part of that was the pandemic, but I also was going back and forth on whether this should be a book largely about bootlegs, because there is the story of illicit reproduction throughout the book, or whether it should be more focused on the technologies used for official and licensed distribution. And I finally decided that a chapter on bootlegging was probably sufficient, but I was interested in the way in which as you're saying, there are economies and communities centered around this activity of sharing things that the people that are sharing them don't have the right to share them, but also they feel a kind of ownership over their copy. And so they're essentially they're trading things where it feels like, there's the language of the master that is the original file, and who has the master and who has the right to share the master or the originating recording, is a thing that can't really be enforced legally because it's all illegal, but there are community standards and practices that somehow still make this economy kind of work. So that was interesting to me, and I wanted to get into that a little bit, but I didn't feel that. Anyway, there were other parts of the book that I was more interested in getting into, but what really interested me is I knew that it was the case that there were bootlegs long before the internet, and I didn't quite know how that worked. And I know some of your listeners probably will laugh at this point and think about how young we both are, but I feel like it is I just didn't know how trading could happen before before it was possible to meet people online or whatever. And so I think what I learned, there were a few volunteers at the library that knew people who knew people who knew people, and then once I started talking to folks that had participated in this in the 1970s and 60s, they knew friends who were still alive and around who were also willing to talk to me, usually on the condition of anonymity. But yeah, it was just fascinating how pervasive this has been really since theater was created. I mean, the Shakespeare's the Shakespeare quarters that I was talking about earlier are very likely illegal reproductions of the text as best as people could remember it. And whether those people that were doing the bootlegging, as in the modern era, whether they were actually connected with the production, as is often the case, or whether they were just fans who managed to write things down, is unknown yet to scholars. But yeah, so getting to know how that trading happened, what the technology was for recording things when you couldn't just slip a digital recorder in your pocket and record something like that was, I think, one of the more fascinating journeys that I made during the writing of the book.
Yeah. And as you say in the book, bootlegs move from illegal contraband to invaluable historical documents relatively quickly. And like my site focuses on the legal stuff because I think it's important that artists are compensated properly and that we're not stealing work from people. But it is, even some of like Pacific Overture is technically the version that's online is technically it's not I guess you'd say it's pirated because it's like you said before, it was only released in Japan. It wasn't released in the US. So but that's if we have access to it, this, a very important historical show and, the people that worked on it and what it meant for theater at that time, we should have access to it. But is it right that it's on YouTube and the people who worked it are not getting compensated for the thousands of viewings that it's now getting?
Right. No, exactly. And I think you make, for the listeners, you make an important distinction there that I don't know, linguistically, there's no real reason for this separation, but it seems like it's kind of observed that bootlegging, as I define it, are those recordings that are made without authorization and that are shared also without authorization. But there's the person that recorded it made that recording, whereas pirated copies are things where there is a commercially available version out there, and maybe it's not authorized to share it, but it was made legally and then it's shared illegally. And so most of the fretting in the post days of Napster and all that have been about piracy, where people are taking recordings that could be bought, and instead of buying them, people are sharing them for free. Whereas in the case of bootlegging, it's creating things that couldn't be bought, but where the actual creation of the recording was not legal.
Yeah, and it's hoped that like as we make legal recordings more readily available and accessible, that it will prevent bootlegging, that people won't need to anymore. But there's always those fans that need to see every single cast change and
right. Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
But also it is a document of history. It's very fascinating to me.
Yeah.
We're running short on time here. I have so many more questions. But I'm going to go to my segment, my favorite things, where I ask you my favorite questions. These are a few of my favorite things. To start off with, what is your favorite musical?
Oh, I always have to answer this question and I make something up. So the answer that I typically give is Sunday in the Park with George, which I think is not untrue. I like Hamilton a lot. I like Octet, Dave Malloy's Octet a lot. I'm trying to think of things that I've seen very recently. Oh, during the pandemic, I thought Heather Christian's "I'm Sending You the Sacred Face" that was performed at the Theater in the Closet, Theater in Quarantine by Joshua Gelb. And it's available for free on YouTube and like legally on YouTube. I think that it's really fantastic as well. I thought, and I guess this season, I think my favorite thing I've seen so far is probably Here We Are, the last time I've seen.
I still haven't made it there. It's
yeah.
on my list.
Yeah.
It feels criminal that I haven't been yet. Do you have a favorite musical filmed live on stage?
I think like a lot of people, the filmed Into the Woods is the one I've watched the most, probably. Although certainly I said Sunday was my favorite show, and while I have seen lots of live, as I've seen lots of live both Into the Woods and Sunday with George, I think the Sunday recording is great too. So probably one of those two, Into the Woods or Sunday with George.
Two of my favorites too, and I love Into the Woods is like the gateway drug for many people.
Right. Yeah.
So a filmed live musical is not exactly a stage show, and it's not exactly a film. So what should we call it?
I feel like there's something along the lines of cast recording that we need to have there. That maybe, in fact, it is a cast recording. It's a recording of the cast. But I wonder if a video cast recording or a cast video recording is the language that maybe we could start using. It's a little inelegant, but maybe some order of those words would be good.
I really like that. That's a really great answer. That's got my brain ticking. I really like that. What stage musicals do you wish had been filmed?
Oh, legally anyway. Yeah. But that's so hard because I'm going both way back before it was really possible and also into recent years. I mean, there may well be a legally filmed but not yet legally distributed version of Octet. And I'm sure there's a full B-roll somewhere.
Yeah.
But yeah. So yeah, that would be one that I wish, because during the pandemic, Tim Malloy released Ghost Quartet because he had the rights to do that.
And also Beardo, which I loved.
That's right. Yeah. And also Beowulf, actually, the early version of his.
Oh, I missed that.
Yeah. So I'd love to see. I would love to have a recording of.
So what you're saying is we need a Dave Malloy box set.
That's true. Exactly. The 5 by Sondheim, 6 by Octet, or by
Octet by Malloy.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
I love that. What would you like to see filmed in the future?
I would love to find a way of doing filmed immersive theater. And I think that's where computer gaming, probably some of the technologies of computer gaming come into it. And I don't quite know, there's a number of reasons why Sleep No More would be complicated, but I think, now that it's closing, it would be sort of nice if there was some document of it. But yeah, I think those experiences that are where the user participates, at least in the choice of what to follow, I think that would be a really interesting next step for film live theater.
Oh, I'm like picturing a VR Sleep No More, where you could like go in and do like open the drawers and do all the things, but
Absolutely.
with the VR headset.
Yeah.
I'm sure there is no money left to do that. Can't do motion capture at this point in the run.
Right. Yeah.
Very sad.
Yeah. So I guess you asked for musicals. What do I want to film? I hope that they do Here We Are we did so I hope they do release a commercial version of Here We Are.
But it's something we can access at Tufts one day when it closes?
Once it closes, it'll be possible to access it at Tufts.
I do have a quick question about Tufts. What do you wish people knew about the Theatre on Film and Tape Archive?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, the Theatre on Film and Tape Archive is part of the theater division here at the library. It's a set of about 8,000 or so recordings, and of those 8,000 recordings, about half, or maybe a little less than half, are things where the theater division went out and filmed the performances ourselves with the permission of all the rights holders. So I guess things to know about it that people often don't know. One, we don't like. There's always the joke in the libraries that people say that the British Library, the Library of Congress, has everything that's ever been published. That's not true. It's also not true that the Theatre on Film and Tape Recording Archive has everything that's ever been performed. But we do have a good set of things. So thing one is that it's always good to check to make sure that we have the thing before you make a trip to New York to see it, because we're not able to capture everything. Two, we have to raise funds for it every year. So it's not like there's this huge amount of money that we have to record Theatre on Film and Tape. So if any of your listeners are generously predisposed to support the collection, that would be fantastic as well. It truly is a like by viewers like you sort of situation where, and maybe even more dire than that we begin with, I think, we begin with very, very little money at the beginning of each year and then have to raise money to film whatever we can at the start of each year. As far as use goes, we no longer need to require people to come up with a specific research reason for using the collection. As long as you've got a library card, you are welcome and encouraged to come and use it. And we'd love to see anybody that can make it up to our reading room. It's like a lot of research and archival reading rooms. It's can be a little intimidating to get in. You have to check your bags and coats and walk by security and those kinds of things. But once you're in, it's I hope it's very easy to use, and we're all really eager to make the collection available to theater lovers and fans and scholars and performers everywhere. So yeah, I guess those are the big things.
That's awesome, and highly recommend if folks can get there to do so, because it truly is a treasure trove of. I wish that the video that you had at the 50 Years of Tufts exhibit could be, I know rights reasons it can't be online, but it's such a wonderful highlight reel of like what is available in the collection. I was like, as I was watching, I was like furiously making notes okay, add to my list of things to come and watch.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and it is the case that we really would love to make. It's not that we're like tightly holding on to them and wanting to keep people away. We want to make them as available as possible, but we also respect the intellectual property of the people that made the things. And so, and there's different, even in the community, there's lots of different opinions about like how open should archival video, whether it TOFT or otherwise, be. And it goes to all the same questions that we were talking earlier with the economies of video distribution and that sort of thing.
Yeah. And this is a whole other podcast episode, but the work that Betty Corwin and Hal Prince had to do to negotiate with, the 19 different unions to make it possible and to allow that work to keep going. So there's lots of, it's not just gatekeeping. It's not gatekeeping, period. It's there are lots of other things, other factors at play. And finally, where can we find you online?
Oh, good question. So I am my username on all the social medias is Doug Reside, at Doug Reside. I'm on Facebook pretty actively, and I have a public. I don't think I hide my Facebook stuff usually, so you can find me and follow me certainly there. I don't really do anything else that actively right now. I used to have Twitter, but I've kind of abandoned it with everybody else. I have an Instagram account that I almost never update. So yes, Facebook is probably the best. And if you look for me on the NYPL website, you can find my email address. I can say it's Doug, my name, Doug Reside at nypl.org if you want to email me.
Awesome. And we'll have links to all of that in the show notes, and also links for where you can buy your fabulous book, Fixing the Musical.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for taking the time to talk with me about the book. It's always fun. You write the book and send it off, and then unlike in the theater where you can hear the applause of the audience or whatever, it just is sort of a deafening silence until reviews finally come out or whatever. So it's great to talk to someone.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Filmed Live Musicals podcast is created and edited by your host, Luisa Lyons. FilmedLiveMusicals.com features information on nearly 200 filmed stage musicals from around the world and dating back to 1938, a weekly newsletter with upcoming streams, and this very podcast. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube, and make sure to sign up for the weekly newsletter to have upcoming streams delivered straight to your inbox. Filmed Live Musicals is financially supported by Josh Brandon, Geraldine Brewer, Belinda Broido, Andy Capone, Elliot Charles, Rachel Esteban, Mercedes Esteban Lyons, Hannah Graneman, James T. Lane, Jim McCarthy, Allison Matthews, Al Monaco, David Negrin, Jesse Rabinowitz and Brenda Goodman, David and Catherine Rabinowitz, Joe Tillotson, and Beck Twist. If you would also like to support the preservation of the history of film stage musicals and the creation of one easy place to find them all, you can now make a tax-deductible donation to Filmed Live Musicals via The Field. Visit filmedlivemusicals.com to learn more. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and thanks for listening.